How's it going, YouTube? So today we're going to be talking about capitalism and why socialism is a death cult. In order to do so, I think we first need to spend some time talking about some basic social psychological principles, mainly the difference between civil society and culture, and then discussing the two primary drive out of which culture originates. Okay? So anytime you're talking about anything human, it's incredibly complex. These two phenomena are integrated, right? But for the sake of understanding, we're going to separate them and talk about them separately. All right. So let's get into civil society. So civil society is pretty simple. It's a biological survival strategy which seeks to maximize cooperation and minimize conflict, right? So we're social creatures. So if you believe in evolution, it's fine. If you don't, I'm going to speak of things in evolutionary terms. And if you're religious, you believe in intelligent design, just use this evolutionary explanation as an analogy, a useful analogy. So primates have systems of civil society, right? They have hierarchies. They have rules and regulations regarding mating and feeding, stuff like that, right? I think in animal or primate groups, they're much more based on dominance and hierarchies, whereas humans are much more cooperative. Even though we have hierarchies, I think compared to primates, we are much more egalitarian. So, civil society, it wants to maximize cooperation, minimize conflict. You can trace the origins of language back to civil society. As pre-human primates moved out of the jungles and into the plains, they had to develop new strategies for survival. They cooperated together in order to hunt. They would hunt sometimes dangerous and large prey, or they would hunt other predators, and they had to learn how to cooperate through signals and sounds and eventually complex language in order to maximize their potential to hunt and feed, right? So when you're living together, you're hunting together, you're feeding together, you're going to run into conflicts, right? So if a male is trying to maximize his potential for passing on his genes by mating with every woman he sees, it's going to create conflict. It's going to create infighting, death, and destruction, and it's going to ruin the potential to cooperate. And so you could see the origins of morality stemming from the need to cooperate. So principles like monogamy and marriage are all about conflict minimization, to minimize conflict, right? So every individual has its own mate, and so since he has his own mate, there's no reason to infight and compete for females, right? So civil society in Western culture progresses towards individualism, right? So in order to maximize cooperation, you have to respect every individual's rights. And as long as every individual's rights are respected, that individual is less likely to become violent and start any sort of conflict with anyone else, right? And so in order to maximize cooperation, you have to maximize individual liberty. So civil society is about survival, is about passing on the genes through cooperation. Our systems of morality within the context of civil society are all about not infringing on individual rights. They're all about cooperation, and they're all about maximizing our strategies for passing on our genes. So our value systems within the context of civil society, say take a chair for example, so it's all rational, it's about rationale, productivity, and efficiency. So as long as the chair serves its purpose, it's sturdy, well built, and comfortable, and that's all we care about as far as the chair. So civil society's values, like I said, rational, about cooperation, it's about minimizing conflict, and it's about it's progressive. It responds to changing times and technologies. You know, it's about civil law, corporate law, family law. All these systems, although not perfect, you know, are all designed within a civil society to keep peace and maximize survival. You could see civil society by itself without, culture is probably the closest we can come to any sort of utopian society, right? So utopian ideologies are deadly and negative, and I'll get into that later. But all the positive pro-social human progress stems from this rational need to cooperate and minimize conflict. So culture is a little different from civil society. Civil society is all about biological survival and passing on the genes. Culture is about our human needs, our existential needs, our need for meaning and purpose, our need to understand, why we're here, our need for a sense of either symbolic or literal immortality, So culture is a response to free will, consciousness, and the human intellect. Most other species on the planet live in a state of stimulus and response, right? There really isn't any space between stimulus and response. They're not self-conscious. They don't know they're going to die someday. They don't really have any free will. They don't have possession of any will. Their biology is programmed to respond to certain stimuli automatically, right? And so in human beings, we evolved into a state of self-consciousness. We have free will, meaning there's a space between stimulus and response where we can choose how we want to respond if we respond to any particular stimuli, right? And we have human intellect. We understand cause and effect. We know we're going to die someday, right? So culture provides belief and behavioral systems to buffer existential guilt and existential anxiety. And we're going to break these two down. And it also provides literal versus symbolic immortality ideologies. So using the chair example, the cultural value of a chair wouldn't necessarily be how sturdy it is and how comfortable it is and how long it lasts. It has to do with more of sentimental value, like prestige, Is it a junky chair or is it like a high-class chair, right? So if I incorporate this chair into my identity, does it make me feel like I'm promoted on a cultural hierarchy or demoted, right? So its value is wrapped up in sentiment, like a sentiment like prestige, right? And so it's all about meaning and purpose and value, not in terms of practical value, but in terms of existential value and meaning, right? So that's culture. It's about meaning, it's about purpose, it's about immortality. It's a response to sort of the anomalies of human intellect, consciousness, and free will. All right, so now let's spend some time discussing the difference between existential guilt and existential anxiety. So, of course, this is way oversimplified. It's much more rich and complex than this. For like a really thorough explanation, you could read Ernest Becker's Birth and Death of Meaning, Denial of Death, and Escape from Evil, 3 books. And if you really want to get into it, you can read Otto Wrong's, I would say, Beyond Psychology and Art and Artist, and maybe Norman O'Brown's Life Against Death, and Kierkegaard's Concept of Dread. All right. So existential guilt is a response to free will. So basically, if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, human beings, since from a single-celled organism all the way up through right before the point of the genesis of free will, it wasn't a genesis, it's something that happened overnight, it was a gradual evolution, but for the sake of our understanding, it's a genesis, right? So you can see we are biologically programmed from a single-celled organism all the way up through primates to respond to the environment automatically. So we live in a state of stimulus and response. So our biology is programmed through DNA and genes to respond to the environment in particular ways. There is no choice involved. There is no free will. There's not much space in between stimulus and response for the prefrontal cortex to engage and problem solve. We live automatically, right? We are emerged in a state of animalistic unconsciousness, right? And so along with this animalistic unconsciousness, there's a state called homeostasis, right? So when you're not looking for food or a mate and you're safe, the biological systems sort of shut down, and then there's this sensation of this oneness with the universe, something like that. You can, like, as an analogy, say like the baby, floating in the mother's womb, warm and safe, completely immersed in homeostasis, right? And so man sort of gets torn from that possibility by having free will. So free will causes a sensation of disorientation mixed with anxiety, and it's experienced as guilt, right? So the feeling of being guilty is the feeling of being in possession of your own will. And so separate from the civil societal context, but in the cultural context, you don't feel guilty because you did something immoral, right? You don't feel guilty because you put your own survival or the survival of the group at jeopardy. You feel guilty because you were in possession of your own will, right? Because you acted outside of the prescribed rigid behavioral rituals and rules, right? So because a man feels guilty with his own in possession of his own will, he wants to rid himself of his will, right? So the way you rid yourself of your will, if you're not able to turn the switch off, you can't go back into a state of real animalistic unconsciousness, right? You're turned on, you have free will, there is a large space in between stimulus and response that you can use to problem solve, engage the reality or any particular phenomena, develop strategies to respond and then respond if there's a response, right? And so you want to create, and these things are integrated and mixed, and so some aspects are true with both, but you want to create a symbolic reality, right? And in that symbolic reality, you want to have extremely rigid rules of behavior that you follow, right? And so you don't want to have any choice. You want to be programmed and conditioned from birth, all the way through your childhood, to live automatically. You don't care about the larger questions in reality, right? All you care about is ridding yourself of your own will. You don't want to achieve anything. You just want to escape back into darkness, right? Back into animalistic unconsciousness, right? But in order to do that, in order to live automatically within a symbolic environment, you have to have a dominant leader, right? So you have to have an enforcer involved, someone who enforces a particular set of morals and values and behavior upon the group. Without the enforcer, you don't have that biological sort of reaction to violence or to harm in order to kick you in to sort of a conditioned, sort of responsive living. So man seeks rigid systems of behavior in dominant leaders, right? And so the trick is to rid yourself of free will. You create a symbolic reality, you transfer your will into that reality, and then through hierarchies and dominant leaders, usually tyrannical dominant leaders, you are then fed, manageable helpings of your own will back to yourself, or back to you from the culture, right? And so existential guilt in the cultural is a So culture is separate from civil society. Existential guilt is one of the origins of culture, and the part of culture that is originated, that is created from existential guilt, is these systems of rigid behavior, right? So for example, if I say fuck when I hit my head, right, that is described a negative sort of connotation, right? You're not allowed to say fuck, it's dangerous, something's wrong about it, right? But if I hit my head and say darn, even though I'm expressing the exact same emotion through two different words, right? So having this dichotomy of good versus evil behavior, and if I condition myself to live, rightly or good, I'm able to avoid being in possession of my own free will, and I don't spend any time actually, thinking about whether there's any practical difference between the two, right? So anyways, existential guilt, I think I explained it clearly. All right, so now let's discuss existential anxiety. So existential anxiety is a response to mortality, or our knowledge of mortality, right? So a useful way to look at it is to say that, the prefrontal cortex, right, our problem-solving center and impulse control center and all that kind of stuff. This is oversimplified, of course. Say that your higher evolved area, or the brain, sort of, they act like an external environment to the lower areas of the brain, the reptilian brain, right? So just like your external reality to your conscious minds, it seems external, right? And so I'm looking at this whiteboard, and it seems like an object that's external to myself, but in reality, the light's bouncing off this, and my eyes is picking up the light, and then there's an image that's recreated in my brain, right? So my whole reality is taking place inside my brain right now, right? So it's basically a hallucination, right? So just like the external reality is to your conscious mind, you could say your prefrontal cortex is an external reality to your reptilian mind, right? So it's just an analogy. So your knowledge of death, right? Your human intellect and consciousness, and the realization that your body is going to die someday, it acts as an external threat to your reptilian brain. So it's just your consciousness of death triggers your sort of fight or flight mechanism, and it creates an ongoing state of anxiety, of existential anxiety, of death anxiety, right? So so a response to death anxiety, just like our response to our fear of our own will, is to create a symbolic reality, right? So if our actual biological reality, inevitably ends in death, as a response, we create a symbolic reality. It's a higher reality, and in this higher reality, anything's possible, right? So we can create systems of literal or symbolic immortality. So literal immortality would be religion, right? Buddhists believe that you have they don't believe in a self or a spirit, but something, the simple I reincarnates, right? And in Christianity, obviously, they believe they're in the soul, and the soul outlives the body and will go to heaven or hell, depending on how rigidly they behave in order to the subscribed sort of behavioral systems intrinsic in that religion, right? Like I said, so a lot of the responses, a lot of the strategies are similar with both, because they're both sort of integrated into one drive, but there's contradictions. So another another method is symbolic immortality, right? So if like, for example, if you can leave a memory of yourself behind, right? So through your children or through your achievements, the culture remembers your name, right? And you feel like your legacy is going to outlive your body. That's not as anxiety relieving as a literal immortality ideology, but it helps, right? And I would say a level under that is simply a justification for being alive, having some sort of meaning or purpose to being alive. It's not just all just a random accident, and you're not just a decaying, rotting mass. That there's some purpose for your life, right? And so you can create a purpose, and you can create meaning to the world by using a cultural worldview, right? And so every culture is different. They all provide meanings to their participants in different ways. But basically, that's what existential anxiety is. It's just like a biological reaction to your awareness of death, right? And so the organism, or you, respond to your awareness of death and the subsequent anxiety by creating an alternate reality, a symbolic reality where anything's possible, right? Where you convince yourself of ideologies that relate to symbolic immortality, and then or religious ideologies relating to literal immortality, or simply just justifying your existence. And all these act as sort of a buffer between your conscious self and your biological triggered anxiety or flight or fight mechanisms, right? Let's see, so let's go through this. A response to mortality, the prefrontal cortex as an external environment, went over that. Immortality, literal or symbolic, we went over that. Life justification in terms of meaning and purpose. And, the source of the creative urge, and it needs will, right? And so, one of the main differences between anxiety, death anxiety, or existential anxiety and existential guilt is existential anxiety is about eros, right? It's the life force. It's the driving to survive, right? And so it has sort of a creative force to it, right? So you're creating something. You're not trying to tear something down. Like with guilt, you're trying to rid yourself of your own will. And existential anxiety drives you to create meaning, right? And to create purpose, to create, immortality ideologies. So that's it for existential anxiety. And so next, let's talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between the two, and get a little bit into, how these relate to both capitalism and socialism. All right, so just to summarize a bit, so existential guilt translates into the need to fit in, right? With as little will or creativity as possible, right? I say will or creativity. This alludes to Otto Ranke's work in his book Art and Artist, where he talks about the difference between the productive type and the artist, right? So the artist creates and he interacts with the community through his work. The productive type takes the creative work and makes a profit off of it. So there's a relationship between the willful and the creative, right? But they're both forms of will. And so the person who's uncomfortable with their own will, feels guilt in possession of his will, wants as little creativity and will as possible, right? So they want a worldview and a role ready-made. So they would like to be told what to believe, what to value, what their system of morality is, what role they play in society or with any particular organization. They want to just be able to sort of scroll through the Rolodex of cultural role templates, basically. Learn the role, sort of act out the role, fill in their names, and just live out their lives. So, existential anxiety sort of translates into the need to stand out, right? So they have a need to build or create, to be productive, willful, or to be creative, to create art forms, to build houses, to create in some way, right? They want to stand out and receive recognition, and they want to be remembered, right? They want to leave something behind that people can remember them by and earn their sense of symbolic immortality, right? So everybody has a little bit of both, right? And so if you wanted to do a real simple typology, you could say, so say if we measure these drives in terms of weight, right? So some people have maybe 5 pounds of existential guilt and then maybe 15 pounds of existential anxiety, right? So this person is going to go out, he's going to build something, maybe start a business, creative work of art. He's going to take it to the marketplace, he's going to sell it, be successful, be recognized, right? And then his need to fit in may just be his sense of moral principles, right, related to civil society. He respects individual liberties, he's nonviolent, he's cooperative, and just this basic sense of morality is good enough for him as far as sitting in and transferring his will, because he transfers his will into this system of morality and he's happy, right? On the other hand, say if you have someone with 15 pounds of existential guilt and 5 pounds of existential anxiety, this person might just be a good employee. He doesn't want to go out and create his own business or create anything for himself. He would like a ready-made position, someone telling him exactly what he's supposed to do every day. He'll conform. He'll be a good worker bee. You know, he'll be a great asset to a company because he's not going to think for himself. He's just going to, if he's a man, he may want more of a dominant woman to marry, you know. So he wants the least amount of his own personal will and creativity as possible. He doesn't want to deal with the world or his own will. He wants to project it out, transfer it to systems and other individuals who are more dominant than himself, and then live out his life like that, right? So both types need a symbolic reality, right? A reality that's sort of layered on top of our biological reality, right? And so they need values, they need morality, right? They need systems of sort of sentimental prestige hierarchies in which they can, you know, climb, right? And then they both utilize Freud's defense mechanisms, but in different ways, right? And so next we're going to get a little bit into the defense mechanism of projection and of transference. We talked a little bit about transference earlier, but so this sort of wraps it up. The need to fit in, the need to stick out. We both have, everyone has both, right? Some are more creative and willful, and some are more prone to just want to fit in. So the need to fit in, the need to stick out. All right, so now let's talk about transference and projection a little bit. So these are some of Freud's defense mechanisms. There's a bunch more. Like I said, I'm oversimplifying everything in this video because it would just take far too long to get really deep into it. But so transference is, for the person with existential guilt, is a transferring of will, right? So he doesn't want to be possessing his will, so he transfers it to, you know, systems of morality and hierarchies and dominant individuals. And the relinquishing of reason, right? And so you can't think for yourself. In order for any sort of cultural meaning system to have any potency, you can't really analyze it because it all sort of falls apart upon examination, right? Because we actually live in an extremely relativistic world, right? For the most part. So you have to be able to relinquish your ability to reason. So these both relate to sort of, well, they relate to transferring as will is more for the existential guilt part. Relinquishing of reason is both. And then the creation of idols as representatives for the ideal, right? So if for people with a lot of existential anxiety, they're trying to climb a social hierarchy, they're trying to, you know, achieve a state of prestige or cosmic specialness or something like that, right? So you have to be able to believe that simple sentiments like class and prestige exist. You know, there's something that exists really in the world, right? So I would put prestige on the same level as like gangster swagger or something like that, right? It's just like a pretending that something is more fanciful than it is, right? And it's an acting out of this character role template where, you know, you're special and prestigious or something like that, right? So, you know, obviously that falls apart, you know, upon just very simple examination. And so you have to be able to relinquish, you know, your reason to a certain extent in order for any of these cultural meaning systems to have any potency in your life, right? So idols represent, like, this is a form of transference, right? Ernest Becker talks about this a lot, where say you take a superstar, right, and he's very handsome and he's famous and he's confident and stuff like that, right? So you want to believe that this system of prestige exists, right? And so even if you know that you don't meet these ideals for yourself, you're not very handsome, you're not famous, like you want to believe that these things are real, right? And so you sort of live vicariously through idols, right? That's what being starstruck is all about. Ernest Becker talks about it in some detail, right? Where it's where you're vicariously experiencing, you know, the high point of cultural achievement through the idolization of idols, of figures, right? And so as a form of transference. So projection is a little different. So it's moving responsibility from self to other, right? And moving emotions from self to other. So basically, so let's take death anxiety, for example, right? If your death anxiety is not depleted, you know, in the cultural framework, right, and you still have some death anxiety, you know, that you're in possession of, your biology seeks to find a reason for why you're feeling anxious. You know, why is your fight or flight mechanism triggered, right? And so what you'll do is you'll create a reason. You'll project danger onto someone else. You'll see someone else as a threat, right, in order to justify the anxiety, right? And the behavior usually following a projection is that if you fight the person, if you commit an act of violence on the person, or you just wipe the person off the face of the earth, you are now conquered your own death anxiety in that sense. And so that's what we mean by projection. So the responsibility of your own anxiety gets projected, as well as the emotion itself, right? This person's the source of these emotions, and so I need to wipe this person out or deal with this person in some way in order to avoid these feelings of existential anxiety, right? So guilt is experienced, right, as guilt and shame. People want to get rid of their free will. Your free will is almost like, you know, a foreign body, you know, some kind of a virus in your body, right? And you know, a foreign body is sort of your biology responds to it with disgust, right? And so anything disgusting you want to just get away from, you want to wipe it out, right? So anytime a person is not able to rid himself, or he's just have an overabundance of existential guilt, you know, he'll transfer that feeling of guilt, shame, or disgust onto another person, right? They'll judge the other person for their weakness. They're weak, and you know, they don't have any, you know, sense of morality. They don't follow the rules, and so forth. And so a lot of like racism and discrimination sort of comes from this transferring of shame or guilt and disgust onto another group of people, right? So you got transference and projection. So cultural lifespan, right? So like I said, you have to relinquish your reason, but you can only relinquish it for so long, right? You know, pretty soon reality creeps in on you, and the cultural sentiments that you live by become exposed for what they are, which is delusions, right? Basically. So cultures always start with a renaissance, right? Something new, a new life, a new meaning system. It brings value to yourself. You know, you can deplete your will into a new system, a new set of hierarchies. That's, you know, a new president or a new king. You know, someone that's gonna change the world for the better, right? Or you know, there's a new style of dress. You know, and by, you know, achieving a perfect representation of this new style of dress or dance or whatever, you know, you're able to, you know, obtain a sense of specialness or something, right? And so there's always this life and excitement with a new cultural value system, right? And it's a renaissance, you know, it's a breath of life, right? And then there's a period that the culture will go through a period of decay, right? So slowly people start recognizing that these sentiments aren't really anything in themselves, right? So all of the 20 pounds of a mixture of existential guilt and existential anxiety that was depleted in the behaviors and worldviews associated with any particular culture, they come back on the individual, right? The individual has to take possession of their own anxiety and their own guilt, because these cultural meaning systems start to break down, right? And so all cultures end in some sort of genocide, right? Or war. So we don't have anything to do. We can't project or deplete these guilts and these anxieties in any sort of potent cultural worldview once it breaks down, right? So the tendency is projection, right? To project all of our existential anxiety and shame and guilt and all these things, all our human stuff. We project them on another group of people, right? A foreign, country or government, or maybe even like a race, like the Nazis, towards the Jewish people, right? So these cultural systems, when they break down, they always end in some kind of mass genocide or war. In big societies, millions of people tend to die, and this tends to be the cycle. So we have the creating of these cultural worldviews that temporarily sort of deplete our human stuff into the worldview. They break down, they go through a period of decay, and they end in violence. And this tends to happen over and over and over, all throughout human history, right? So finally, next we're going to get into capitalism, right? And we're going to take everything we discussed about civil society, our need to fit in, our need to stick out, and we're going to discuss this cultural life cycle in the context of capitalism. All right, so let's talk about capitalism a little bit and see how it stacks up. So in the context of civil society, so remember, civil society is about maximizing cooperation, minimizing conflict. It's about progressing towards individualism, right? And its function is biological. It's just there to create a safe environment for people to live, feed, and then pass on their genes, right? So we can see the effects on capitalism because it pulls third world countries out of poverty, right? So if you look at India and China right now, since they're becoming more capitalistic, the quality of life for all of its members, its population is increasing, right? So and with increasing lifestyles, increasing quality of life, increasing wealth, comes a decrease in infant mortality. That's proven. A decrease in infectious diseases. That's also proven. As far as individualism, free market capitalism is actually the purest form of democracy, right? Because every individual can vote with their dollar, and the companies that win or lose are completely based on the votes of every individual within that population. So it is the purest form of democracy, right? It lowers population, and so some people claim there's a problem with overpopulation. I don't know, but the fact is, as countries become more wealthy, when they integrate capitalism into their societies, there's less need for children, there's less infant mortality, and so people just have a need for less children, and they tend to birth rates tend to decrease, Capitalism also promotes individual growth and education, right? So if you want to compete in a capitalistic society, you have to have some talents, you have to develop yourself as an individual, and you have to become educated, either skilled or educated in order to compete, right? So it sort of checks all the marks, right? So it's about cooperation, right? So we cooperate, we have to agree to use a particular currency and then go by this particular set of rules, right? It's also about the individual, right? The individual can enter into a free market capitalist society, with an idea. They can build a product and sell it and become successful, and your success is completely dependent on your own, effort and creativity and talents. No one's standing in your way. It's an individual sort of centered, So it checks all the marks as far as civil society. So you're more likely to pass on your genes. You're more likely to have a higher quality of life. Cooperation is maximized. Conflict is minimized. It's a pure form of democracy. It's the most positive, economic system, and the most productive and universally beneficial economic system in history. Free market capitalism. So, how does it work out for culture, right? So it's inclusive to all types, right? So it values both will and creativity. So the people who are more prone to want to be willful and achieve, to build a big company or to build works of art, to make a big difference in the world, to achieve that sense of symbolic immortality, right? And it also values conformity, the person who just wants to be a worker bee, who's sort of too overwhelmed by his own sense of guilt, existential guilt in his will, that he just wants to sort of conform to, hierarchical systems. He wants to have a boss, he wants to be told what to do, right? And he wants to do a good job, right? And he gets a sense of value by this quality of conformity, right? How well he does this job, how well he listens to his boss, So it values both. They're mutually dependent, right? So, as a willful person grows a company, he's going to need employees, right? He's going to need people to work for him. And so the capitalism is inclusive to all types, across the entire spectrum. Anyone can enter into a capitalistic society, in any personality type, any character type, and they have an avenue for success, or at least to meet their basic human biological needs, right? I mean, even people with a Down syndrome, you see them working at different stores, as greeters or even fast food restaurants. Obviously there's going to be some people who are too disabled to be able to participate in a free market capitalist system, and I think it's our responsibility to take care of those individuals. But so it provides a layered hierarchies, right? So it's not just like a government that exists in a position of power, right? Into which a person can project their own personal will. You have different hierarchies at work too, right? And it's not just work, so you have social hierarchies based on your cultural role templates, which groups in society you associate with. And so a capitalistic system provides multiple hierarchies and multiple avenues, to sort of deplete your existential guilt and anxiety. And then maybe the most important is it has a stabilizing effect on culture and provides a resistance to violence. So this is really interesting. So like I talked about before, how all cultures have a lifespan, right? They have a renaissance, a period of decay, and then they disintegrate. People are left to their own devices. They're left with all their feelings of guilt and anxiety and shame and disgust and all that. They project it onto another group. They annihilate that group in a war or a genocide or something like that happens, right? It's a little different in free market capitalistic societies, right? Like ours in Western society. So if there was a time where we're ripe for a good genocide or a good war, it's right now, right? So if you look at society, all of our meaning systems are breaking down. We're entering into an extremely relativistic sort of worldview where even like things like sex and gender, they don't have any meaning anymore, right? Someone could be gender fluid. There's just masses amounts of ferocious propaganda in the media trying to separate people. It's men against women, blacks against whites, rich against poor. There's just so much money getting pumped into this destabilizing propaganda, right? And then recently, last month in November of 2017, there was supposed to be this big Antifa thing, right? And so, George Soros, this sadistic oligarch type piece of, what? They pumped so much money into this thing. They took an ad out on the front page of New York Times, right? And so, that would have been the trigger right there, so we have, our meaning systems are all shit, there's all this infighting, all this animosity between groups, right? And all it takes is just one little spark to explode into like civil war or genocide or something like that, right? So a lot of real intelligent people, who understand this cyclical cultural sort of thing, how it always ends in genocide. They're shitting their pants, right? But on that day, 11/22 came, and then it's crickets. You know, nothing happened. You know, why is that? You know, all the signs are there for just a mass genocide, a mass war, or a civil war. You know, just a total destruction, and then nothing happened. Why? So, capitalism, right? So in a capitalistic system, as meaning systems break down, especially in consumer capitalism, if you look at it from that context, so when a 40-year-old, you know, he's 40 now, he's having like a midlife crisis, all his meaning systems are gone to shit, and, you know, he's getting fat, you know, women don't like him anymore, you know, he's going through an existential crisis, right? So instead of going and joining some revolutionary, you know, group and projecting all that hatred and disgust on another person, you know, he just goes and he buys a new car, he gets a boat, he starts a new hobby, right? A woman that's in crisis, you know, I know some women that they change their entire identity every 6 months, completely different hairstyle, you know, different makeup, you know, different dress, you know what I mean? And that same woman in the 1930s Germany is going to be the one yelling Jew, you know, pointing the Jews out to the Nazis to project her disgust. But instead of having to do that, her existential guilt just gets depleted in this consumer capitalistic cycle where you're constantly redefining yourself, right? It might not be the healthiest thing, but we live in a really destabilizing time, a really unstable time that's ripe for violence. And we're not seeing violence because all that human stuff, all that human projection that normally would get played out in genocide gets depleted in the consumer capitalistic system, right? So the consumer capitalist system is responsive, you know, it has a stabilizing effect on culture when during periods of sentimental or existential decline, right? And you can bridge that gap. And it's extremely resilient as far as taking care of people's needs. It's proven that during times of economic turmoil, people tend to spend a little bit more, right? So when they're worried about the economy, they're having these fears and anxieties, the way they cope with those anxieties is a lot of times just going shopping, right? And it's this increase in shopping, this increase in consumerism that actually it buffers the economic decline, right? It builds a bridge and bridges the gap of that decline. And so the economic system in terms of providing for people's basic needs becomes more stable, right? So what we're seeing here is capitalism not only takes care of people's, you know, physical needs, you know, and allows them to pass on their genes in a safe and cooperative and by avoiding conflict and all that kind of stuff, but it also it sort of takes care of these anomalies created by human free will, consciousness, and intellect, right? You know, it provides a stabilizing effect for culture, and it minimizes violence, creates a resistance towards violence, right? So I would say the free market capitalistic system, including, you know, what is seen as unhealthy, you know, forms like consumer capitalism, you know, they actually for this time, you know, are extremely healthy. You know, they're a lot better than the alternative, where, you know, there is no consumer capitalist system. There isn't like this infinite, you know, sort of Rolodex of different identities and aesthetics and consumer products that you can delve into in times of great guilt or anxiety, you know what I mean? That you can conform to, that you can build up, and, you know, you can role play. So those are the benefits of consumer capitalism, and I think, you know, our economic system, our free market capitalistic system needs to be protected. It's just as important as the Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution, right? And yeah, so some of the criticisms of capitalism is the existence of imperialism, right? And so they say, well, you know, because of this capitalistic system, people who are extremely narcissistic, you know, and violent, sadistic, and they want all kinds of power. They can use the capitalistic system to consolidate power and inflict, suffering on other people. But those types of people have always been around. I mean, they were around. They were around in communist systems. They're around in, back in the all throughout human history. These types of individuals have always been around. The people who are hyper narcissistic, sadistic, so sociopathic. All they want is greed and power. And I would suggest that, in a capitalistic system, it actually creates sort of a buffer or a protection against those individuals too, because of this purest form of democracy sort of thing, right? And so once they're exposed, a certain company is exposed to doing harmful things, people don't have to invest any money in that company. They don't have to buy their products. They don't have to support them, and they can die, right? So the problem comes in when you have all this cronyism. You have crony capitalism. You have, too much socialism mixed in your capitalism, right? You fog everything up, and even as fucked up as our capitalistic system is today, it's still far better than anything, human beings have had throughout history. So, this is my case for capitalism. It has its flaws. Consumer capitalism can be unhealthy for the individual, and it can cause some damage to the ecosystems and stuff like that. But for the period that we're in right now in human evolution, I think it's perfect. Because there's no possibility of ever reaching any sort of utopian society, right? Every individual has the capacity to become either a Nazi sympathizer or a Gandhi, right? And so those potentials, they exist at all times, And so you have to be realistic about, what is humanity? What is the potential for violence and for good in humanity? And you have to appreciate a system, an economic system, based on, a realistic, sober-headed understanding of the culture, of humanity. So let's get into socialism a little bit. So next we're going to talk about, I'll explain why socialism is a death cult. Okay, so finally let's talk about socialism, right? And so we'll look at it the same way we looked at capitalism, right? In terms of civil society and culture. Right? So how does socialism hold up? So first, socialism is not really an economic system. It's more of a social ideology, right? It's about the oppressed versus the oppressor. So basically, in economic terms, the premise of socialism is that people who are successful because they cheated, or they're successful because they're oppressing people who are not successful. So it's the rich who oppresses the poor, and that's how they become in positions of power and success, is through cheating and oppressing others, right? So in socialism, the willful person, the creative or the willful person, and the person who wants to conform and wants reality sort of, fed back to them in manageable helpings, they are in conflict with each other in socialism. Whereas in capitalism, they support each other mutually, right? So the fundamental principle of socialism is conflict, right? And so in civil society that we talked about is about reducing conflict and maximizing cooperation. So in socialism, it fails that test, right? Because the fundamental principle is conflict between the oppressor and the oppressed, right? And so it wants to achieve a state of equity or equality, right? And so it does so by killing or undermining willful creative producers, right? So you saw this in Russia where like say in agriculture, the big producers, the big time farmers, who were extremely successful, and they were successful because they had, productive and efficient methods for producing food, right? But under the socialist ideology, they were successful because they oppressed someone else or they cheated somehow, right? So by eliminating and killing all of the nation's top producers, the creatives, the willful, they actually undermine their own society, right? Millions of people starve to death because the producers were gone. They were killed, and so there wasn't anybody who had a good system for growing agriculture, right? So in socialist economic systems, you see this conflict, right? It's a lack of cooperation. The individual is hated and is seen as a danger. So people who act in their own best interest, who go to the marketplace with a good idea and they build themselves up, are seen as a danger to equity, right? Because as long as you have individual liberty and individual freedom, you're going to have inequity, because people have different levels of will, they have different talents, intelligence levels, creativity. And in any free society, you're going to have inequity. People who are not the same, people are not equal, right? So you have the willful creative producers are killed or undermined. Individualism is hated and seen as a danger, okay? So socialist or communist societies usually end in starvation and mass murder, right? It's an irrational utopian ideology. So this is why utopian ideologies are dangerous, because they misunderstand human nature, right? And so if you have the idea that human beings are fundamentally good and equitable and want everything to be even and fair, right? And it's only, a certain group of people who are, sort of tainting or screwing this utopian up, then you can justify the murder of all these people you see as opposed or in the way of achieving a utopian society, right? And so a lot of the mass murder happens as a justification to achieving this utopian society, which is completely irrational and impossible, right? So it fails pretty much every mark, So it does not provide, a safe and cooperative environment that minimizes conflict to reproduce, to spread our genes. It actually ends in starvation and mass murder. The individual is hated. The individual must be suppressed for the good of the collective, right? Usually ends in starvation, and it's irrational. It's a irrational utopian ideology that misunderstands human nature. From the cultural perspective, it stems from an unstable resentment, right? So from individuals who are guilty but too narcissistic to conform. So basically they're people who want to have their cake and eat it too, right? And so they're too uncomfortable with their own will, right? They can't, or they're not talented enough to enter the marketplace to achieve anything substantial, right? And yet they're narcissistic. They think they're more special than everyone else, right? And so instead of working on themselves and building themselves up or accepting that they have shortcomings, they'd rather project all this guilt and shame and this blockage to their narcissistic identities onto a group of producers, a group of successful people, right? They'd rather see themselves as being an oppressed victim, a self-righteous oppressed victim of some ruling class, right? And then through a socialist system, murder that ruling class, instead of actually working on themselves and working through the capitalist system to achieve a sense of self-esteem or cosmic specialness, symbolic immortality, whatever you want to call it, right? So it's top down, and it's used by sociopaths to gain power and influence. So it's not an organic sort of grassroots system of economics like capitalism is, right? Capitalism is the purest of grassroots. Is every individual contributing to the economic system in order to extract wealth and provide for themselves and their families, right? So if you have an unequal society, right, and society is unequal because one group is oppressing another group, right? In order to maintain equity, there has to be an authority figure, right? There has to be someone to step in and commit violence on a certain group of people in order to maintain that equity, right? And so people who are in this state, of narcissism and guilt, are easily manipulated by people who want to see themselves in power, right? And so these imperialist type sort of sociopathic power hungry people that capitalism often gets criticized for are actually, you know, much more dangerous in socialist or communist countries, right? So the reason this is a death cult, one, is because it ends in starvation and mass murder, right? The other reason is a fundamental sort of drive in socialism is anti-life, right? It's anti-will, it's anti-creativity, it's anti-production, right? It wants to eliminate any producers out of this resentment and jealousy and its own self-hatred and disgust, right? And so the fundamental sort of driving force in socialism is this almost this need to return to animalistic unconsciousness. It's counter evolution, you know, it's de-evolution, you know. So this has been a long video, and I hope I ended okay. I think I got it all out. It might have been a little sloppy. So this is my first video, which is going to be a lot. So I've given you a product here, right? If you're still here, thank you. That's awesome. So in the description are some links, some ways that you can purchase this product after you already received it. So if it's of value to you, you know, you think you got some value out of it and you want to support me, you can go to PayPal or GoFundMe, and the links are in the description below. Like, subscribe, thumbs up, thumbs down, I don't care. Leave a comment. Let me know if you want me to do any other issue. See, I've been talking too long. Let me know what topics you want me to discuss. This one was pretty intense. So yeah, we'll stop it there. Like I said, like, subscribe, donate if you want, comment, and thanks for watching.